Welcome to Laser Views. Due to some technical difficulties with filming the episode you're about to watch, the audio is a bit lower and worse quality than I'd hoped for, but the emotions I felt while filming it, the whole video is so very personal and so very genuine to me that I decided to keep it as is, even with these difficulties. So if you're willing to bear with me and watch what is probably to me my most personal video so far, and a video where I talk about what might be the most horrifying, terrifying movie I've ever seen, which also touches on the cultural impact of it, but also the historical setting of it. It brings this horrifying movie and another movie, I'm talking about two movies here about nuclear devastation. I take them and bring them to the contemporary society and talk about why these resonate with me so much and why they are so groundbreakingly, fundamentally devastating to my mental health. So if that sounds interesting to you, then please stay with me. But do turn up your audio a bit, because otherwise you probably won't be able to hear a thing. Every now and then I do add subtitles when I'm mumbling a bit too much, or when the microphone simply could not pick up my sound. But aside from that, just if you increase the volume to your liking, then I really hope you will be able to enjoy this. Enjoy my thoughts. It might be the wrong word to use here, because this is not really a movie you enjoy. This is not a concept you enjoy. This is pure horror. Thank you for watching. Welcome to Laser Views. Today is going to be quite a different video than what I normally make on this channel. I have been in a dark place for a few weeks, and right as I entered this dark period, I made the very smart decision to watch Threats, the nuclear apocalypse movie from 1984 that is quite dark, to say the least. I didn't intend to make a video of it. I didn't intend to review it. I didn't intend to talk about it. It was purely for my own pleasure, or maybe displeasure, because it kept staying in my head. I couldn't get it out. I just kept thinking about it. And that's why I'm making this video today. This movie really, can't say it resonated with me, but it stuck with me. And it is an amazing movie. I think it's a really good, it's a masterpiece. It's really good. It's fantastic. But it's also awful. And it's a difficult movie to talk about, because it's a movie you should experience. Very gritty, realistic movie about the end of human civilization by our own hands, by our own misdoings. And although essentially the horror of this movie feels a bit retro, the whole concept of nuclear war feels like something of the distant past to my generation, to people who didn't grow up in the 80s. It has made a comeback. The threat of nuclear apocalypse, it's re-entered our life. It's re-entered our realm of possible endings to human civilization. Of course, it being scary, it still in some ways is shadows in comparison to global warming, that the effects of climate change and nuclear apocalypse might seem distant and even insincere in this broader scheme of things. Watching the past unfold in this real way, in this expressed in this fear people had not too long ago, and realizing we have that same fear today, even with all of the threats looming around, all of the threats threatening and our existence, nuclear war is still one of them. We are distracted by many other things. We are not in the same apocalyptic mood as we were in previous generations, but it's still there. Threats is therefore not just a mirror to the past, a snapshot of a time where the threat of immediate nuclear war was ever present. It was omnipresent. Or was it? That's another thing. It's still relevant. It's relevant, but it's also interesting to see how things have developed since 1980. I'll not talk too much about the production of Threats, but it's relevant to say the idea to make Threats came in the early 80s after then head of BBC, Alastair Minay, I don't know how you pronounce his name. He had watched The War Game, another BBC production from 1966. It had been screened at a few venues, a few theatres, especially for the music festivals, but it had never really been shown on BBC as it was meant to. It was meant to be aired on TV. Well, it was deemed too graphical, and I can understand why. I will talk a bit more about War Game a bit later. I think I want to talk about Threats first, but then I'll return to The War Game. But he had seen The War Game and essentially commissioned Threats. It was deemed necessary to enlighten, educate, or frighten the British populace regarding the very real threat of the nuclear apocalypse. And in doing so, they created perhaps the most realistic depiction of the outbreak and aftermath of nuclear apocalypse ever put to screen. I will have a little note here, side note. I am not an expert in the fallout and destructive capabilities of nuclear war. I don't know if all the details in it are correct. I read somewhere that the nuclear winter, which is in this movie, that actually it really wouldn't happen the way it has previously been considered to happen. Of course, nuclear weapons today might have developed in a way that would mean we wouldn't necessarily today have the same outbreak as in 84, but even considering it from 84, the perspective of that, it may not even then have happened the exact way the movie depicted, but it at least does a very, very good job at coming very close to presenting the outbreak and aftermath of a nuclear war. And not just that, it's I think the scariest part of it is not the aftermath. It's not even the outbreak. It's what leads up to it. That is the real horror of the film. Okay, the scary scenes, the terrifying scenes happen after that. But the real terror is how it was not stopped, how it could have been prevented, how people reacted. And it's so frighteningly real. It's so frighteningly realistic. So threats. I'll not talk that much about the plot, but I will mention some basic things. First of all, the movie opens up with telling you why it's called Threats. You see a spider spinning its web. And it's explained by the narrator that everything in society is connected and everything is relying on each other. And it's these connections of modern society that makes it so vulnerable. Because if one thing falls apart, if one aspect of it collapses, then everything collapses. That's why it's called Threats. There are a few people you follow in the movie. You have the first two people you see, a young couple, where it turns out that the woman is pregnant. And the man has to make the rash decision of marrying her. They seem to be working class. So much so that the soon-to-be husband is still living with his parents. That's how young he is. Relatively poor they are. Then you also follow the two families, so his parents and her parents. Finally, you have a group of politicians, the local administration in Rochester. It's a very good dynamic because the couple, they essentially have to just focus on what do they want with their life. Life is just happening and they have to adapt to life, still making plans, still getting their new apartment ready. You see a few scenes where they are putting up the tapestry or getting down with the old tapestry and then painting the walls, seeing how she vomits because of her pregnancy. You see how the family are dealing with minor issues such as a brother-sister dynamic, with the young brother being a bit annoying, not really caring enough about school, and then parents being worried about the future of their children. And then you start seeing this bigger picture with the politicians starting to worry that we might be heading towards a disaster. And it's actually there from the beginning. As the couple is sitting in the car, in the very first scene you see them in, they're listening to the radio. And the radio is about that the Soviet Union launched an invasion in northern Iran. And the guy switches on the sports. He's trying to shut out the world, the reality. He's not even doing it consciously. It just doesn't concern him. Considering that this is made in the early 80s, we had the invasion of Afghanistan. We have had so many wars and proxy wars across the world. What is yet another incursion? Why does it matter? But it escalates. The movie takes place over multiple days, a few weeks even to begin with, and then years. What starts with border incursions turns into use of tactical nukes on military bases, the sinking of warships, and then before you know it, full nuclear war. And I think, well, what's so terrifying about this? People are living their lives. They're not really caring about these things going on, but also, what can you do? There's one scene where the boyfriend, the young man, is sitting in a pub and his friend comes in.
Iran? Americans have just said Russian.
Iran? That's not the Far East, you pellet. That's the Middle East. China, Hong Kong, that's the Far East.
So what? It's far enough, isn't it?
But look at those two girls over there. Aren't they hot? Aren't they some flybirds? And he says, no, shh. I'm watching the news. How can I think about women when all this is going on? Don't you think this is scary? Don't you think this is terrifying? And he replies, yes, but we can't do anything about it, so we might as well enjoy ourselves. Which is scary, because it's true. Of course, some people do try to do something about it. There are, in the days and weeks leading up to the nuclear war, you do have these protesters, these protests trying to warn about what a nuclear war would mean. What would the Soviet Union conquer? What would the Red Army conquer if a nuclear war broke out? They would conquer nothing but ash and bone. It's what being said in the movie by the protesters, but of course the protesters are accused of being Soviet spies or Red sympathizers because it's unpatriotic to talk about the need to de-escalate the crisis instead of saying, oh, the red's gonna have it. And you also have, of course, real concerns, but because people, why do you protest about nuclear war? We are having, the economy is bad. This is during Thatcher, so at this time the economy is really bad. It's a hellscape in the UK in many ways. So people, why would they even care about the economy, the war, when they don't have money for anything? They're living in basic squalor. Might be exaggerated, but things were really bad. So why would you think about the war when the economy is bad? Again, something I can really relate to now. That's why it's so frighteningly realistic, and why it's not just a good picture of the 80s, but also of today. Why do we care about global warming? How can we worry about the rising sea levels and the extinctions of multiple species when we can't afford food, housing? We can't even afford to have children in a meaningful way situation. So why should we care about global warming? The same idea, of course, could be so many other things. What should we care about the risk of nuclear war when we're just worrying about basic existence? There's so many parallels you could draw between this and today. That's again, what makes it scary. It is a terrifying movie. Of course, it is drama, but it is essentially a documentary. It feels like a PSA, but done very well. And it goes into then what happens when the bombs drop, what happens in immediate aftermath, what happens in the years after. And you essentially see society just gradually collapse, and you see politicians make very tough decisions. The war cabinet, essentially, they are trapped inside the basement, inside the bunker. They can't get out, but they're still the government. So while suffocating and not having enough food, they are themselves making plans for the rest of the country, and they have to make tough decisions. They don't have enough food. Again, threats. The whole world is connected. We don't really necessarily rely on our own countries to produce our food. We are often relying on networks. So in times of crisis, countries will start just stockpiling and not exporting their own goods. And that's what happens. The beginning of this has a food crisis. There's not enough food in the country. Of course, the more people die, the more food will be available, the stuff that's not contaminated. And they do have this discussion going on. Well, should we give food to everyone, or should we actually only give food to the people who can work for it? Because they need people to do a job. They need people to burn corpses. They need people to dig through rubble, and they need units to go in and stop looting, because people are desperate. There's not enough food, and you have looters around, and they're being shot by the police, they're being shot by the army. You have rioters protesting against the rations, and then they're being shot. And it's just so frighteningly realistic, because how would you act during a nuclear apocalypse? It's just a complete breakdown of social order. Of course, all trade has stopped. There's no real governance left. People are left up to their own devices. What they have left is basically subsistence farming. It becomes feudal, in a sense, that there's nothing but miserable lives as farmers, with people dying of early age because there's no advanced medicine, there's no technologies, there's nothing left, there's no oil to run machines, there are no real hospitals, there's no real educated staff, no real school system, it's just farmers having miserable lives. Essentially, it's even sub-feudal in the standards of living. And it's all because of this world that we created, all this world that we found ourselves trapped in. The decisions we made, the cumulative effect of decisions we made, brought us down this path that once we were on it, it was so fragile. All it needed was a small flare to ignite and destroy everything we knew and bring us back hundreds of years. And not just that, essentially we sowed the seeds of our own destructions, even more than the actual destruction of the societies we knew, because we destroyed our own humanity. What you see is this pregnant woman giving birth in the post-nuclear world, and you see her daughter grow up. And this daughter, she has a very basic grasp of the language. She doesn't seem very intelligent. She seems very naive, very small essentially. She seems like she might have the mental capacity of a 2-3-year-old. And you see all other children, and they're teenagers, they're not small children. It's the same. And not just that, they kind of develop their own language. It sounds very tribal, it's definitely not English, but it has English sounds in it. And the movie doesn't say this explicitly, but I'm quite sure what it implies is that, as we know, malnutrition, stress, and radiation will have a hugely negative impact on the children during pregnancy and also, of course, after pregnancy. So these traumatized parents, it's not just that there's no proper school system for these children anymore. It's actually that the world we created, the malnourishment and stress and hunger and starvation and deprivation of it, made our next generation or future generations. We degraded ourselves. We actually retarded ourselves. I mean that in the definition of it. We set ourselves back mentally, physically. We destroyed everything we had. Human innovation led to human retardation. And that's why it's so frightening, why it's so scaringly real, because we still live in this world. Of course, we have some other conflicts, some other huge problems that we try to escape that are not as much tied to this aspect of technology. But of course, climate change has come as a result of innovation, of all the energy it required, and of course how we also get the energy, to put it very, very, very simply. Even then there are these parallels. It's a terrifying masterpiece. It's one of the scariest movies I've ever seen, and it just doesn't stop. I'm not going to say how it ends, but it doesn't stop. The horror doesn't stop. There was a real fear of nuclear war. It was quite widespread, but people being people, it wasn't the only thing in our lives. People were focused on starting families, focused on getting enough money to get their own apartment. They were worrying about how they would get the grades to get to a school they wanted to go to. And as such, the threat of mutually assured destruction kind of subsided. We blindfolded ourselves. And not even that. A lot of the people are shown to simply being too ignorant to understand what's going on, too ignorant to understand the calamity that a world war would bring, so indoctrinated with the hatred of the enemy and patriotism that they don't even listen to the smart voices that tell them, that warn them about what's happening. People are blinded by their own self-interest, their own lack of knowledge, largely, probably, one would argue, the flaw of the education system that instilled this patriotism, but also blind ignorance towards nuclear war. And I don't even think I'm reading too much into it. There's just so much happening in this movie that a lot of it is not dwelled on that much. But it's there, and it's scary. And we see it today. We see it so much today. And that's why it stuck with me. That this movie, I can't let it go. The more I think about it, the more it reminds me of the state of the world we are in. And how the only way to look past mutually assured destruction, and I'm including global warming, as individuals, we can do so little. So how can we accept it? We can accept it by ignoring it. Silencing the thoughts in our mind. Silencing the warnings. Because we can't fathom it. We can't accept the true calamity, the true destruction that awaits us. Not because of our own mistakes. Because of our societal mistakes. Political mistakes. Geopolitical mistakes. Things we have little control over. We are the pawns, the puppets, the victims of this system that destroys us. It's the horror of threats. But I'll also talk a bit about the war game and how it differs from threats, not just in its plot or its film shot, but also in how things had even changed between 66 when the war game was made and then 84 when Threats came out. First of all, the war game was made for TV. It was a short 45-minute theatrical documentary. It had a very real purpose of simply telling people about how a nuclear war could start and what would happen. Essentially the same as Threats does, but in a different way. It starts out talking about where the different bases are, where the different targets are in the UK that would be hit, how the state would prepare for it or how they might not prepare for it, how actually a lot of things would just go wrong, how the entire concept of evacuating people itself was complicated. It has a lot of fake mock interviews where during the things that happen, during things unfolding and also during the aftermath, the reporter interviews people. And it's actually involuntarily fun a bit because it's a product of the 60s. So this very proper, calm, authoritative British narrator is just talking with the same monotone tone throughout the entire film. Even after everybody is dying and how they're talking about how bad things are, he's still talking the same very stiff upper lip way, which is, I don't know, there's a cognitive dissonance there that I liked. And also the people he's interviewing, they're the same. Someone talks about, well, okay, yeah, pretty much everyone here is dead. The acting is awful in it, so that doesn't help, but he might still emphasize how terrible things are, and he might still show a bit in his face how bad things are, but everybody seems so calm and collected when talking. And also they did a good job at making a very realistic depiction of the average Brit in it. Like Threads, it does take place in Rochester, and they're just talking to everyday people. People have no idea what radiation is, how it would affect society, how an aftermath of a nuclear war would be. It talks to people who don't believe or do believe in the outbreak of a nuclear war, and it talks about very real issues like how can you afford building a shelter, because one thing that is a bit laughable about this is it has duck and cover vibes. So people are told, okay, yeah, you just need to put sandbags up in your home and you have a nuclear shelter, because of course we only need a few sandbags up against the wall, and that's how you can avoid being burned and blasted to pieces by the atom bomb. Of course, I mean, there's something real about it. If your house is so far away that you will not be hit by the big blast wave or the heat wave, maybe you still need to shelter yourself from splintered glasses, or there will still be some shock wave that can be absorbed by the sandbags, but your house has to be in such a specific location from the blast zone for it to be relevant. So it just felt like that desperate duck and cover vibe, that you try to tell people there's hope, even though there's absolutely no hope in this situation. Tragically, there's absolutely no hope. And the movie does demonstrate, yeah, there's no hope. Why did this movie come out the time it did, and how does this reflect the real fear of nuclear war? So, of course, the idea of global nuclear apocalypse was something that took shape in the 50s after the Soviets acquired the bomb. As the stockpiles developed, as suddenly we had the beginning of the Cold War, we had clashes that might see the idea of the bomb being dropped. The Douglas MacArthur, general of the United States Army, wanted to drop one in Korea. The idea of dropping the bomb had been floating around since they were actually dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it was a formative period. There was still this fascination with the bomb. There was the Bikini Atoll giving us the bikini. There was radioactive toys, radioactive sets for children, radioactive makeup. But then the 60s came. The 60s is when the real threat of nuclear war really hit in, really set in, and created, at least among some people, an absolute fear of nuclear apocalypse. And there are several events to explain this. Well, first and foremost, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was, at the time, the closest we ever got to all-out nuclear war. And I think it made really people aware of the dangers of it. But then it was itself only a part of a bigger development. We had the Berlin Wall suddenly dividing East and West in a very distinct way. We had the idea that, of course, this Cold War would not be over anytime soon, even though in 56 we did have the détente. But even that was a bit, how much could you really believe in the détente? Because at the same time you had collapse of imperialism, of European imperialism and colonialism. So you had all these wars and conflicts in Africa and in Asia. You had the effects of the Congolese Civil War was still going on. You had civil war in Algeria. So in 65, 66, you had, of course, the Vietnam War being at its peak with the massive bombings of North Vietnam. And at the time this movie was made, also the concept of maybe a Chinese invasion of South Vietnam in response to the US monstrous bombing of the civilian population in North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, I think it was called. And that's actually how the nuclear war breaks out in this movie. It breaks out because China invades South Vietnam and doesn't relent. They don't back down from US pressure. So China, and that's one thing that's very interesting with this compared to Threats. In Threats is a Soviet US or Soviet NATO thing, but even so more so Soviet US, because Britain is really shown not to play a big part of it. Then we have China being the responsible part in the war game. And I think that's another one thing I want to bring up. At this point, the United States and the Soviet Union had a lot of nuclear bombs. But actually the stockpile had increased. I think the Soviet stockpile increased by sixfold by 1984. And the Chinese had just acquired the bomb. So suddenly China was a nuclear power. And China, this was the time of the Sino-Soviet split. And we had border conflicts with China, India, with the China and the Soviet Union. We had all these conflicts going on everywhere. It was a frightening time. A time of sort of an identity crisis as well for these European countries that suddenly, actually, even Britain that had been the most influential power in the world, they were seeing their own power crumble. And suddenly they were just a pawn in this big game. Britain itself in the war game is seen as playing a very little role in actually creating this nuclear war. They're just there. They're just victims. Of course, that's very easy to say when they do have a lot of nuclear weapons themselves, but it's the US and China and the Soviet Union that set off the war, not Britain. And I think that just the whole cultural, historical perspective on the war game is very interesting. It does give you a very good idea, not just about the fear of nuclear apocalypse, the fear of great calamities that was present in the 60s and was relatively new in the mid-60s. But also this whole idea of the world crumbling and how it affected these countries that no longer were at the peak of their power. It shows a nation and a people who used to be a great power and is now a strong, relatively strong ally of a great power. Essentially, the movie doesn't really point fingers, but it is clear that, of course, the real threat to them is Soviet or communist expansion, something that was really perceived at the time, the domino effect, that communism was on the rise. Even though at this time, the idea was still that the Vietnam War would be won by the West or by the South, it was a strange time. It was a time of great concerns, a sort of identity crisis as well. Even if it was the threat of the East. It is actually America that fires the first bomb here. I think it's very, very interesting that it's the United States that launches the first nuke, not the Soviet Union, not China. And then it describes that the Soviet Union is then forced to use its entire nuclear stockpile as to not lose them in the American strike. Essentially the concept of mutually assured destruction. It would have been so much easier at the time to show, no, it's the evil Soviets. But isn't it so much scarier? It's actually your allies that fire the bomb. It's your allies that destroy the world. I find that to be particularly scary, particularly concerning. And I think it does a very good job. I think the movie itself is not that good, but the ideas of it. And I can definitely understand why this movie would not have been shown on TV. It would have probably caused mass hysteria. This is such a realistic depiction of how everything would be lost very quickly. And although it is more optimistic about the post-war future than threats, perhaps because, again, the nuclear stockpile was much smaller. And although we had seen the peak of nuclear destruction with the Tsar bomb at the time, nuclear weapons did develop. And you had different types of weapons. Of course, the destructive capabilities of threats was more prevalent in the 80s. Just the idea of showing this to the British population in the 60s, it kind of blew my mind. Even though it's not that visually disturbing, it's actually quite tame. You don't see much, you see smudged faces, but it's chaotic and it's frightening in what's happening. And I think that's enough. Threats has much more scary imagery, but conceptually, this is very frightening. It has one scene that I did find quite scary, essentially. That there is this place where they are trying to find all the corpses or identify all the dead. They really have very little opportunity to do so. So what can they identify people? By their wedding rings. And this looks like it's a small country house. It's in Rochester. So not really the outskirts of Rochester, not really a big place. And they just have this bucket full of wedding rings. I think that's such a strong visual. I think they did a really good job with this. I still think Threats is a much superior movie, but I do think that if you have seen Threats, you should also see The War Game. They do offer something quite different. It's an interesting movie, but I think I should return to talk about Threats. So Threats is definitely a movie I can recommend. It's a movie that does feel very relevant, very real, and truly terrifying. I can't, of course, know with certainty it will affect you the same way, but I do think that you might risk falling into the same nihilistic pit I fell into, and I was already in, essentially, when I watched it. It is a terrifying movie. It is horror in its purest form. And what's so scary about it, it's so real. Horror, when it's a monster, it's a movie. This is one of those horror movies where, no, it's not just a movie. And it's not just history. It very well could be our future. And we should try to make sure that future doesn't happen. Let's assume the meaning of Threats. The Threats wanted to make sure this future didn't happen. And the best way to do that would be to educate with all the information it had. Educate, truly educate, not pull any punches. Create the most terrifyingly realistic experience that would then make people act. And of course they did. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the first secretary of the Soviet Union and slowly but surely embarked on ending the Cold War. Deals were struck between him and President Reagan, between the Soviet Union and the United States, to drastically reduce stockpiles, to reduce tensions, to try and pull out of conflicts that could result in nuclear wars. They at least temporarily succeeded. We do have fewer nukes in our stockpiles today. We do have less of a threat of actually using them, but it's still there. More countries have nukes now than they did in 1984. There's a very real risk of nukes being used on a small scale or on a large scale. We could see our world end in a nuclear apocalypse, but it's not the only thing to fear. And I think it's just a threat that seems even more real to me. I had traveled to see many of these sites that played a role in the conflict, in the possible nuclear war between nations. I've been to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where they also happen to have a huge radar facility, a massive, one of three the Soviets built. Instead of building satellites, they focused on radar technology. At the time, they didn't know it was insufficient compared to satellites. I've seen the destruction of radiation. I've visited nuclear missile bases. I don't have much footage of it. I have some photographs and it's not... But I've seen these sites that were ready to destroy the world. And our world came very close to being destroyed. I did mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. It wasn't the only time. There were several people during the Cold War that solely were responsible for not escalating. There were multiple flaws with the technology developed. Several times the Soviet and the US or European satellite radar early warning systems would malfunction. Several times people had to make the decision to see if this is an attack on them by the enemy or to discard it as yet another technical error. And we came very close. And we have few names we should remember to really thank for not having destroyed the part. And this reliance on technology today, of course, our technology is more advanced. So there's a tendency today to think that technology will save everything. We shouldn't fear malfunctions. We shouldn't fear what technology can do today because it's better. But no, there can always be flaws, and not just technological flaws, human flaws. We are not in a situation today where our technology is so advanced that the threat of nuclear war, that the threat of climate crisis, that the threat of so many things is no longer real. It is real. And I don't know what we can do about it. I would want to end this video on a positive note, but what can I do? What can we do? Remember that what we have is precious. We live in a web of threats, and it only takes the breaking of one or two to see the whole web come crumbling down. Let's just hope they will never break.